All right, everybody. It's 3 o'clock in Berlin, Amsterdam time, and I would have the pleasure to welcome you all at today's AIMA lecture. Today, on the occasion of World Soil Day, it's one of the better recognized world days, which of course goes in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals, and AIMA as an association which tries to bring together many different perspectives when it comes to agriculture, of course, has the great pleasure to do a topic that is close to our core mission. And therefore, we're happy that you all joined in from many continents, as it is very often with these AIMA lectures. As you already have been noticed, this lecture will be recorded, and we will afterwards post this lecture on our YouTube channel as well as on the website. And without further ado, I want to hand over to my colleague and General Secretary Deb Reed, which will guide us through today's program. And I'm happy once more that you're all here. Enjoy the lecture and talk to you in the discussion again. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. And for everyone's pre-planning, this is the order. We thank Barb Corson for reaching out to Stephen Leslie and Bennett Gould, who will each share about 10 minutes, thereabouts, of information relative to how to develop a soil health frame of mind, Stephen Leslie's farming perspective on farming to regenerate soil, Bennett Gould's perspective on sustainable forest management and soil stewardship, and then I'll wrap up as time allows with a broad overview of agricultural museums and soil stories. So without further ado, Barbara Corson can take it away.
Thank you, Deb, and I want to also thank everyone who's participating in this small seminar about a very big topic. And I was really excited when Deb Reed asked me to be involved, and I was happy to accept the task of assembling a reading list because I really do love reading. But when I sat down to think about it, I realized I had rushed in where angels fear to tread because the subject of world soil is really too big and too complex to reduce to a reading list by one person. Even in English, it's too big, let alone the other languages. So next slide, please, Deb. It's not just that, I think we missed one, but that's okay. It's not just that soil is complex, it's also the fact that humans are complex. We're all interested in different subjects. Some people love science and other people love economics and some people love history. And all these different interests act kind of like lenses through which we see reality. And it's not that one is true and the others are not true. And if we were rational beings all the time, we could realize that it's true that both culture and science, like for instance, you can say, if you add limestone to the soil, it raises pH, that's science. And if it's culture to say, around here, we never have added limestone to our soils. And those two statements can coexist. And if we were rational creatures, we could accept that. But we're unfortunately not always rational. And we, because we're so complex creatures, next slide, please. I think that it might be wise to include on your reading list books that help you understand and get along with other people. And I chose these two books because the titles are kind of tongue in cheek. But seriously, it does help, I think, for us to get along with people who are different than us if you understand something about human psychology. So next slide, please. The importance of igniting a spark of interest starts when people are very small, right? It's important to get children interested in nature and the human nature connection. So on the left are two books that influenced me when I was small, Charlotte's Web and Farmer Boy. And currently there are lots of formal education projects going on, like I have here pictured Shelburne Farms project series. Shelburne Farms is a member of the Northeast American organization, which is called the Farm-Based Education Network. And I just put this in here because I think it would be a great idea if every community had systems in place for connecting kids and their parents with farming and natural cycles. Next slide, please. Well, anyway, I started out early learning about soils, and as I learned more and more about it, I learned more about wait, sorry, I missed the slide. Sorry. The next step after igniting a spark is feeding the fire. And in my case, these books were fuel. They were written long ago, but then I was born long ago, so that's appropriate. I won't go into descriptions of these books in the interest of time, and they're probably familiar to many of you anyway, but any one of these books could be a subject for discussion. And I'm hoping we'll have time afterwards to discuss some of the different ways you can gain understanding. Next question, next slide, please. Okay, so once you are aware of the crises you face, then I kind of made a category of books that focus on potential solutions. And these are examples of books that I read that propose different solutions to the crises. And included on the right are two books that are by members of AIMA or presenters here today. And I wanted to include them because it was books like Paul Starkey's Animal Traction and Stephen Leslie's Horse-Powered Farming books that made me convinced that bioenergy, that is draft animal power and human energy, have a real part in civilization going forward as well as in the past. Animal power is the thread that connected me as a veterinarian to historic groups like AIMA and ALFAM and XARC. Now I'm ready for the next one. Thank you. Lately, it seems like there has been an explosion of books and articles and podcasts and whatnot that deal with nature and soil and climate change and sustainability. And my reading list has never been longer than it is now. Some of the books are not specifically about soil per se, but they are about the connection between humans and the more than human world. And I want to mention Fiber Shed specifically because that's not about food, it's about fiber and the effects of the textile industry on the soil and the necessity for cultures, civilizations to develop a fiber shed, as well as, we're talking about food sheds and water sheds, but we need fiber sheds too. And on the upper right are the two books that I've read recently, and they are great books. They sort of sum up the past 40 years of thinking. In the recent past, some members of AIMA and ALFAM briefly discussed having a book club where we would read books and then discuss them online, and it hasn't come to pass yet. But in a forward thinking mode, I put on the bottom right two books that I haven't read yet, but I would love to read. One of them, Hoofprints on the Land, is not published yet, but the other one says An Environmental History of the Middle Ages. What's not to like, right? So anyway, if anybody's interested in a book club, we can talk about that. And then the last slide, please. Those of you who know me knew you weren't going to get out of this without a poem. So I had to put this poem in here. To me, it speaks of not only the shortness of human memory, but also the ability of nature to restore itself and to restore us in spite of our human excesses. And the picture is by a draft animal power enthusiast, Erica Marzak. It's taken in Maine at the Common Ground Fair, showing these two young teamsters and their young teams out in the fields. So now I've given you some examples from my reading list, and I would love to hear more of yours. And in ending, just let me repeat how glad I am to be participating with all of you on this day. Oops, I forgot that was in there. Okay. The end. Thank you.
And thank you, Barb. And now we'll do some brief shifting here so that Stephen Leslie can share his screen. So I will stop sharing.
And you will have to unmute yourself, Stephen.
I realized that I needed to not screen share before I had unmuted myself.
We're all in the same team after all, so.
All right, well, good day to everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you this morning to discuss these incredibly important, vital topics. Just as a brief introduction, my wife, Carrie, and myself have began farming in the state of Vermont in the USA in 1992. Our farm is called Cedar Mountain Farm, and we're a micro dairy milking 20 Jersey cows on a intensive management pasture. And we have a CSA market garden of about 1¼ acre. That's a no-till garden at this time. And we're also partners in Cobb Hill Cheese. We make artisanal raw milk cheeses. And our farm is located at Cobb Hill Co-housing in Heartland, Vermont, a 23 household eco village that's situated on 275 acres of conserved land and dedicated to sustainable living, forestry, and farming. And some of you might be aware of the work of Donella Meadows, the author of The Limits to Growth. She was a founding member of our community and an early mentor of mine as well. So can I change these slides myself?
Yes, so
Oh, great.
hover your cursor over your first slide and just hit your next button or your down arrow.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yep. So the name of my presentation is Where Has All the Water Gone?, which you might find curious on World Soil Day, but hang with me because I think you'll find that everything leads back to soil. And my presentation is also particular to my location here in Heartland, Vermont, or in Vermont in general, but I trust you'll find that the soil health principles that I'm discussing are universal and applicable in every context on the planet. So with no further ado, I'll get started. So my presentation today is Where Has All the Water Gone? It was a hot, dry summer across the region, and in fact, across the Northern Hemisphere. Concerns about water availability in Vermont were recently prompted by the moderate to severe drought that began in 2020. In 2021, some wells in the northern tier of our state began to go dry. This year, for many farmers, the growing season has been a bust. Long-term climate modeling suggests we should anticipate more summers like this. A recent climate impact assessment issued by the University of Vermont shows that over the last 20 years, unpredictable and unseasonable flash droughts have become a common feature for farmers to contend with. Although overall precipitation has increased by 20% since the 1970s and is predicted to increase another 20% by 2050, the water is tending to come all at once, potentially destructive precipitation events, and summer dry spells have grown longer and more severe in their impacts, not only on farms, but also putting new stressors on forest ecosystems and wildlife. Additionally, shorter winters and higher summer temps increase evaporation from land and bodies of water. In response to these drying conditions, the state of Vermont passed a new law that went into effect in July 2022 that calls on farmers to monitor their water use. The aim of the law is to make our lakes, rivers, and streams more resilient in the face of climate change. Any ag operation that draws a minimum of 10,000 gallons in a 24-hour period from surface water must register with the state and record their use. While this data will certainly be useful, measuring and regulating water use at the tap is starting at the end point. If we want to get serious about ensuring our water supply remains stable and abundant into the future, we need to consider how to infiltrate and hold water better for resilience through all extremes. If something like Tropical Storm Irene, which hit Vermont in 2011 and dropped 11 inches of rain in 24 hours, were to have hit the state in 1750, the old growth forests that once covered our region would have infiltrated all that water without catastrophic flooding. Old forests hold 4 times more water than young ones, and 10 times more than even healthy ag fields. Plus, the ubiquitous bioengineering of beavers and extensive healthy wetlands slowed water and kept aquifers fleet. The problem is, we are still quantifying and measuring water as if it were a thing. We need to take a page from the indigenous water protectors who have been leading the resistance to block new tar sand oil pipeline construction on their homelands in the Dakotas and elsewhere, when they remind us that water is life. 3.8 billion years ago, rain used to fall on the bare rock of empty continents and run right back to the sea. It was only after fungi and algae got together to venture out of the oceans and colonize land that the soil formation process began, and consequently that fresh water also gained a foothold on land, cycling through soil, plants, and animals. That original soil carbon sponge, formed of the detritus of primitive plants and animals, is the basis of all terrestrial life, and there would be no water cycle without it. So even though all life depends on water, water depends on soil to catch it, hold it, and slowly release it again. What can we be doing now to create fully functioning forest, farm, and municipal landscapes that mimic the capacity of the ancient forest? To secure a clean water supply must begin with healthy soil. On our small, diversified farm, we felt the impacts of this dry summer on every front. After all, water is the essential ingredient. For example, with the lack of precipitation, the regrowth of our hayfields has been reduced by 40% or more, which in our context means that there is that much less grass for cows to graze on the fields that we fold into the grazing rotation after the first cut, and reduced bale cut on the fields where we typically bale second cut instead of grazing because of its distance from the barn. When it gets dry like this, the farmer puts in the same amount of work and energy expenditure, but reaps lower returns. For us, this translates into having to spend more on bought-in hay, and we can expect the price to go up as operating expenses have increased and yields are down across the region. If we weren't practicing the soil health principles, these negative impacts would be much worse. Soils in poor condition may even lose more carbon during the drought from wind erosion and will be more vulnerable to erosion from washouts if the dry spell is followed by a heavy rain event. For example, the state of Iowa currently loses 5.6 tons of soil per acre per year. That's more than a pickup truck of soil leaving every acre. However, we are also seeing some positive results through the efforts we are making to mitigate and adapt. For instance, we have a field that we grew vegetables on for 12 years. When we started, soil organic matter in this field was 3%. By applying compost at a rate of 20 tons per acre and the extensive use of cover crops, we managed to raise the soil organic matter to 6%. According to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, every 1% increase of soil organic matter in soil will hold an additional 20 to 26,000 gallons of water, which means in the drought, we potentially retain an additional 60,000 gallons or more per acre on this field. In our pasture system, we have identified micro wetlands, typically classified as marginal lands. By excluding cows from these zones, we have seen them jump back to life as functional wetlands, infiltrating and holding water while vastly increasing the biodiversity of the system overall. We have begun introducing trees back into our pastures. Pilot studies have shown that when planted at a density of 20 trees per acre in a silver pasture system, the cooling and soil buffering power of trees increases forage yield and livestock gains by as much as 20%. In our market garden, we switched over to a no-till approach. When the soil is no longer disturbed through tillage, plants can reestablish a symbiotic relationship with fungal mycelium. The permanent beds are healed from compaction, and the deep loamy mulch that develops holds water even on our sandy soils. Climate scientists of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tell us that we have an 8-year window to halt CO2 emissions if we are to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of irreversible, abrupt climate change. In order to meet our binding greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, to clean up our rivers and lakes and renew our agricultural economies, we need to elevate healthy soil as an essential ingredient to solve the climate and biodiversity crises. Healthy soil practices have proven to be the most cost-effective way to sequester carbon. Simply reducing greenhouse gas emissions won't be enough to halt climate change. We need to maximize the carbon sequestration and water infiltration capacities of our farms and forests. In Vermont, we have statutes dating back to 1992 protecting public water supplies and groundwater. Soil should also be designated as a public good. Additionally, just as air and water quality are protected by the Environmental Protection Agency and states are mandated and funded, soil should have the same protections and funding. The good news is, with the tools and methods of intensive organic regenerative practices, we can restore soil organic matter in our agricultural fields as much as 10 times faster than the natural processes of forest succession. While what we achieve may never match the exquisite complexity of an ancient forest, we do have the tools to jumpstart that process. By simply observing how the soil health principles are expressed in the forest, we have all the tools we need to begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a perfect overview, absolutely squarely aligned with the Sustainable Development Goal, which links agriculture and forestry. So let's get back to sharing here and preparing for Bennett Gould to share more about sustainable forestry.
All right, thank you, Deborah, Klaus, Barb, Stephen, thank you for that presentation. That was a great setup for mine here, so thank you. I'm Bennett Gould. I'm with the Foundation for Sustainable Forests. And next slide. So we are a nonprofit charitable land trust. We protect forested land that is typically acquired via donation, bargain sale, sometimes outright purchase. And we actively manage the forests that we own to improve overall forest health and resiliency, but also still harvest timber products from them that support local rural timber economies. Next slide. Our territory is primarily in Northwest Pennsylvania, up near Erie, PA, a little bit into New York, and we have ambitions to expand over into Ohio. At present, we have over 2,000 acres under our ownership and management as sustainable working forests. So I'll talk a little bit about our forestry practices here and then get into the soil side of things, which I know is what we're all most excited to be talking about today. So for our forestry, we believe that there's no such thing as a forest that is free of human impact. Even if it's a virgin forest that has never been cut before, it is still impacted by human activity, be it from the impacts of climate change, invasive species that have been introduced. In Pennsylvania, our deer herds are a large impact on the future forest, eating a lot of the regeneration. If it has been managed, the effects of poorly done forestry can have a long-lasting impact. And likewise, there's often pressure from land use change, from subdivision development, et cetera. Next slide. So that's our forest currently. Looking ahead to the future, we know that there's going to be a higher frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. There's additional diseases and invasives that we probably don't even know about yet that'll be coming our way. And all of these things together really make us think about how are our forests going to respond to their future environment? Will they be able to adapt, bounce back, and continue to be healthy ecosystems that provide the ecosystem services that we need? Next slide. So in light of all of that, it's a real question of should we act or not act, knowing that every forest is impacted by human activities, whether we are directly managing that forest or not. Is it better to just leave it alone and go with the preservation approach, or is there benefit to going in and doing some active management to try and improve the health of that forest? We believe in the latter of active management. So our forestry, you could call it resilience forestry. We're constantly thinking about what the next generation of forest will be. And when we say resilience forestry, we're talking about the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance, be it from weather events, invasive species, disease, to absorb that disturbance without it shifting to an alternate state and losing its function and services. So some of the things that we practice are worst first tree selection, small group selections, and then minimizing disturbance, which is where we'll really get into soil. Next slide. So a resilient forest is diverse in terms of its species, age, and habitat of the tree species that are there. By having a more diverse composition of species and ages, it's better able to respond to disturbance that comes in. You also want the trees that are in that forest to be healthy and vigorously growing. Next slide. In our region, the typical commercial forestry that is practiced is called high grading. That's where the most economically valuable trees are taken out. We often refer to this as take the best and leave the rest. So you're leaving behind the trees that have been most suppressed, have the least vigor, and those trees are what is supposed to reseed the next generation of forest. Over time, this degrades the genetic pool of that forest, degrades diversity if you're only taking out the high dollar value species, and makes the forest less healthy over time. In contrast to that of taking out the best and leaving the rest, we practice worst first forestry. So the trees that come out are those that are least healthy, have been most suppressed by the other trees around them or other environmental factors. Perhaps the trees that are being impacted by disease or pests, or that just have poor growth form. So we're always thinking about, is what we're leaving behind more vigorous than what's cut? Is the average form of the forest improving? Are we keeping the services of that forest intact? And then is what we're removing ultimately increasing the diversity of that forest? Another tactic that we use is small group selections. So this is essentially almost a clear cut, but on a very small scale. So we're talking just a couple acres in size. In forests in our region, light is the limiting factor. And, it's not rainfall, it's not nutrients in the soil, it's how much light gets into the forest floor. So next slide here. So what we look for is areas where the overstory is already at its full maturity and beginning to decline, or where the overstory is just in poor quality, but also where there is a very good regeneration of new trees from the forest floor, that if we remove the overstory, we're letting light in, that will allow that to grow. We don't just cut and hope. There's a bit of danger in doing this. If you do have light dependent invasive species in our region, that would be multiflora rose and barberry, where if those are already started on the forest floor, they will take over the whole forest if you let the light in. So we're looking for areas where there already is good regeneration. Next slide here. And by doing these small gaps, you do one, and then a few years later, you can do another nearby, and then another nearby. We're able to create a diversity of age classes within the forest that then also produces a diversity of understory levels, from scrub down to the forest floor to a mid-story to a healthy overstory. And again, that increases the diversity of age and also diversity of habitat for the species that live there. Next slide. So that's the quick summary of some of what we practice in the forest as far as tree selection in our forestry. And that's all well and good. We could do the best job in the world of marking what trees will be removed from our forests, but a lot of damage can be done if they're not harvested well. So in our forestry, we use highly trained fellers and teams, often of draft horses, that are practicing directional felling of the trees to make sure that they land in a way that minimizes damage to the other trees around them. But then in extracting the logs from the forest, wherever possible, we're using draft horses to really limit disturbance to the other trees and to the forest itself. Draft horses are small and nimble, so they are able to get into tighter spaces in the forest and prevent logs from dragging against the trees that we're leaving behind and causing damage to them. But the impact to the soil or lack thereof is really significant compared to traditional large heavy machinery for removing logs. Next slide. So there's not been a large body of research on the differences in impact between draft horses and the commercial log skidders. We have partnered a couple years ago with a local undergraduate student who began to do some preliminary research comparing the soil impacts. So on one side of this comparison, we've got a team of draft horses. These are Jill and Jane, they're Belgians, and together they weigh about 1,800 kilograms. Slide. On the other side, John Deere 440 skidder. It's actually one of the smallest log skidders that John Deere has ever made. Still weighs in much heavier than the draft horses at 5,500 kilograms. Next slide. So to measure the impact of the two against each other on forest soils, the undergraduate student Owen, who's in the photo there, he set up two separate skid trails parallel to each other and had both the horses and the skidder carry a regularly sized log load across that trail for 20 passes. And in between those passes, he took measurements of the rutting of the soil and soil compaction. Next slide. So this is the horse skid trail after 20 passes. The leaf litter has been a little bit churned, but there's really minimal exposed soil and minimal rutting. This is pretty typical for what we see when we're working with draft horses. If it's a really wet site, there would of course be more disturbance, but it is pretty typical to barely tell that the trail is there. And if you go back a year or two later, you can't tell at all. Next slide. Then this is the trail from the John Deere skidder after 20 passes. The trail actually measured at 35% wider than the horse trail just by the width of the machine. And as you can see, there are ruts really beginning to form. The soil is exposed, the leaf litter's all been pushed off, and there's a lot of root damage as well. With the actual measurements, the skidder did produce ruts. Most of that occurred within the first 5 to 10 passes. Under these conditions, the horses actually created no ruts. But again, if it were a more wet site, the churning of the soil from the skidder and the depth of the ruts would surely have been more. Next slide. And also under these conditions, the horses had no statistically significant increase in soil density, whereas the skidder compacted the soil up to 27% over those passes. So your results may vary, of course, and this is a very preliminary undergraduate study, but it highlights what we've already known, that using these smaller, lighter horse crews really has a significant benefit to forest soils. The impact is much less, and if you go back into an area where the horse crews have logged a few years later, you can barely tell that they've been in there compared to a modern technology skidder. They also cost a good bit less to operate over time. Yes, there are veterinary bills and everything, but when you look at the fuel consumption, they're really just needing food. They don't need all the fossil fuels that a big skidder needs, and they're great to work with good friends to have out in the forest. Next slide here. So that's a quick summary of our forestry and why we turn to draft horses for helping to preserve the forest floor and the work that we do. I know we'll have a Q&A session here, but if any other questions come up, here's contact information as well. You're welcome to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Bennett. That was a great overview about the relationships between maintaining that healthy forest, tree by tree, and the soil underground or undergrowth. And so I will wrap up our day today with, whoops. Well, as usual, did not mean to do that, so we'll get ourselves back here. To wrap up with well, just pardon me just a second. I'm assuming you don't see what I'm seeing.
I see a
We
slide,
are.
agricultural museums and soil stories.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Barb, for that affirmation. So yes, because this is the International Agricultural Museum lecture series on soils, we're wrapping it up with some overviews, broad, about those collections and the ways they can support these stories. I'm a curator of agriculture and the environment at the Henry Ford, which is this colossal museum in Dearborn, Michigan, that has collections focused on U.S. History, but it is a global story because many of the pieces of equipment that we actually hold had international distribution streams, and many of the companies still do. But what I'm going to focus on today is the ways what we have needs to be a catalyst for thinking more deeply about how museums tell these soil stories. So historic sites and museums have soil. They contain soils and sediments. They also contain soil science artifacts. And a combination of these things across sometimes centuries provide evidence of human engagements with soils and sediments over time. I'm not going to go into a real detailed micro study of any particular place. We have heard two great examples of that already. Instead, I want us to think about the ways that these pieces of evidence, the artifactual, the archival, and the material and the immaterial cultural heritage, convey soil stories. Often we work with static displays. In our newly updated Ag and Environment exhibit in the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, this International Harvester manure spreader shares ground with several plows that you can see on the plinths to the left. This is within one of 4 sections. This section specifically field preparation and planting in this uplifted exhibit. Now, that title panel is Farming America, and it emphasizes land mass rather than soil. But that was my approach to urging guests to study the machinery that they see and that farmers used to transform landscapes and ecosystems from coast to coast. And then the language explains that the small number of farmers, less than 2% of the population today, still manages 40% of that US landmass. And guests really can be concerned about those pieces of machinery that operated centuries ago that got us where we are today. Unstated in this title panel is the added context of indigenous peoples and land policy and that kind of massive change. But we hope that this still inspires guests to walk through the exhibit to find out more about these individual objects and the land masses that we all inhabit. Those static displays have been the source of educational opportunities since Henry Ford put them together back in 1929. This shows boys at the Edison Institute School doing some close reading of several plows, including to the far left, this Oliver plow. The plow that the Oliver Company argued was the world's best plow and that they distributed across the globe. This pristine example came directly from Oliver Plow Works to Henry Ford. A modified, or I should say a reconstructed Oliver plow also became part of the Firestone Farm, a living history farm that opened within Greenfield Village in 1985. This is a 1986 photo that shows that being put into practice. I would argue that all too often these living history farms operate like time capsules, but there are good ways that decades of living history scholarship has shown that you can still be true to a past practice, but convey a current science or a current culture about a plow. And today that current culture is that those walking plows are really essential to organic agriculture. If in essence, organic means draft power, horse or mule or donkey power, ox power, and not a fossil fuel power. These 3D artifacts, the cultural practices, the archival evidence, all combine to flesh out the past stories. And then what's our job of taking that past forward? That's inherent in the Henry Ford's charge. So archival evidence, the Oliver Plow Works spread out pamphlets with incredible detail about how to set the plows for soils of your space and for the technique you were attempting on your fields. In a different kind of context, agricultural scientist George Washington Carver published bulletins like this, one focused on the soils of Macon County and another on maintaining soil fertility, to his audiences, which were Arkansas or Alabama farmers specifically, but farmers across the South, many dealing with soils degraded over centuries of monoculture, cotton culture. The how-to advice is part of our present as we continue to collect information about different approaches to agriculture, namely, what differences exist between urban agriculture and a vegetable intensive cultivation, not a livestock intensive cultivation, as well as current entrepreneurs like Melvin Parson here in the middle, who works in his We the People Opportunity Farm to counter recidivism with soil engagement. And there's Melvin with his rototiller in a plot that he maintains with his We the People Opportunity Farm. Carver bulletins then became the basis for a guest activity that focused on soil science, but emphasized the long connection between Carver, soybean genetics, soy science, especially Chemergy, transforming that plant into an industrial product, and the consequences of that to our food systems. At the heart of this is the soil, as these folks conveyed through a nitrogen fixing activity. And then behind them, you see the John Deere 7000, which is also known as the Max Emerge 7000 conservation planter, which was the first commercially successful planter that's basically the product of a company, agricultural implement company still in business. Lots of qualifiers here. We don't celebrate this. Well, we convey the facts about this machine, not in a glowing way about conservation planning, but in as complicated a way as we possibly can to indicate changing practices, different input costs and including a continued chemical intensive production agriculture, even if no-till planters are at the heart of it. These are big stories, and they can't be conveyed in one object label. We combine blogs with expert sets and with ongoing conversations about these complexities. So a couple more slides before we're totally wrapped. There's much material available as national governments became more concerned about helping consumers understand this, and the general public, coincidental to the numbers of farmers shrinking precipitously during and after World War II. The Yearbook of Agriculture has 3 publications that address soils. Soils and Men being the first in 1938, Soil being the second in 1957, with land separated from that as a separate book in 1958. All of these are readily available through archive.org, and you can read all about it. And then we get to where our museums must step up to the plate. Soils, start where your institution has its strengths. Not every museum has a living history farm. Allying with some of your farmers in the area can help the things that are operational within your collections, the equipment, the archival evidence documenting that equipment, and the farmer practices become a multi-dimensional learning environment when you ally with the actual soil. That combination underscores the essence of museums as places where knowledge gets created, where instruction can occur, and where knowledge can grow. Mentioning land as separate but inclusive of soils is important, because that 3D learning environment is the land, and from that land in all its complexity comes food, fuel, and fiber, and also ongoing science efforts to solve climate crises and survive as humans on this planet. I put sequestration in there as one of the current conversations among farmers about soils and forests, and attempting to return the planet to a natural carbon sequestration process. The aim for climate, the agricultural mission for climate, addresses this, but museums can do more to deepen the cultural connections across time. And, provoking questions like what might a soilless future look like, as more and more intense market garden growers go to a soilless system. Oh, we museums are at the heart of this. And I guess the big question is, how will you help spread this story? How can you turn apathy into action on the part of your guests by getting them to think about what they're looking at now in their larger world views? And I look forward to hearing your soil stories as we keep working on this into the future. Thank you. So now we can move towards Q&A. And I know that I am working in the chat. So, and there has been some good action in the chat. So we have and I'll go through these chat questions, but I also encourage folks, if they have questions, to please add them to the chat. So a question about no-till from Lauren Muni. A horsewoman located in a rural region near her, and that's coastal Maryland, told her that farmers in her county started doing no-till and that the birdsong stopped. So she said she was not against no-till, but it was something she noticed. She said that heavy fertilizers were recommended, although till was discouraged. And she asked Stephen specifically to talk about no-till versus animal-powered till.
So I think that's a great question. And the first distinction that would have to be made would be between conventional approach to no-till and organic or regenerative approach to no-till, and specifically the organic, because regenerative can be a rather fuzzy word at times. And so when we're talking about no-till in the conventional sense, it is actually, of course, glyphosate dependent, the herbicide. Also very dependent on applications of NPK and other fungicides and pesticides will be involved in that production as well. And it can often still include monocropping or a very reduced rotation. So then if we're talking, and that's, I think, where you would very clearly see a lack of pollinators, a lack of birds, a lack of wildlife in general, where no-till of the conventional kind is being practiced. Now, it is true that conventional no-till, setting aside the issue of how dangerous is glyphosate, the most used agricultural chemical on the planet today, how dangerous or not is that? Setting that aside, no-till does increase or at least maintain soil organic matter compared to conventional tillage of soybean crops or cotton crops or corn crops where it's used. And that's the basis on which it's called climate smart. But it's a far cry from organic practice, and there's a lot of cutting edge work being done at Rodale in Pennsylvania, eastern part of the state where Bennett's located. And organic no-till, of course, is more of a reduced till. It doesn't eliminate tillage, but it creates a rotation of cereal grains and legumes, often on a 3 to 4 year rotation before plowing is done again. And often will involve undersowing, involves using roller crimpers to terminate cover crops rather than chemical herbicide applications, and is generally seen to, by using multi-species cover crops, really expand the biodiversity of even large agricultural operations. Now, there are some very cutting-edge Amish folks who have broken into the no-till world and are still, raising commodity crops. Some of them are doing that conventionally, but some are also doing it organically. And it was, in fact, Jake Blank of I&J Manufacturing, in partnership with the Rodale Institute, who developed the roller crimper for mechanically terminating cover crops rather than using glyphosate applications. The no-till that I mentioned, just to wrap up, we're applying no-till technology, so to speak, to the market garden, which is a whole different thing than, of course, the commodity farming. We're talking about very small, often hand human labor. We're still employing the horses in our no-till operation because we are a small dairy and have a lot of good, high quality finished compost. We're using that as our primary mulching material. And so the horses have a lot of work there, using the old John Deere manure spreader to apply the compost. And we just recently received a grant through the Northeast Organic Farming Association to purchase a 5-foot roller crimper. So we'll be using that in very small applications of about a half acre to a quarter acre. For instance, terminating a rye cover crop in the springtime in order to directly transplant winter squash or similar crops of that nature. So I hope that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good, thorough overview.
Could I just add that in talking about no-till, I think there is a difference between tilling with a walking plow and a team of draft animals and tilling with a giant tractor that's, dragging multiple mold boards through the soil at 15 miles an hour. So it seems like we use draft animals for tillage for many centuries with not a whole lot of, not as rapid changes as we're having now. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, I think it's really that comes down to the land steward. I mean, certainly a lot of the mollisol soils of Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska were turned by horses in the early part of the 20th century, and as Bennett knows, a lot of old forest was leveled with axes, two-man saws, and oxen and horses. So the destructive power of human beings can be manifest with just with draft animal power. It's how we apply that power. We've we used our horses in a traditional organic tillage operation here for 20 years and increased our soil organic matter by 3%. I think we really healed soil that had been greatly disturbed through corn on corn by the previous dairy farm with a lot of chemical application. And we used an old John Deere, we used a new Pioneer walking plow and an old John Deere 2-horse plow that we could adjust with micro adjustments, so that we did a form of plowing of cover crops called skim plowing. We were really just getting underneath the cover crop, maybe 3 to 4 inches deep, and lightly turning that over, incorporating the cover crop into the top 3 to 4 inches of soil where most vegetable plants do their rooting without a major disturbance to the land, as you suggest, Barbara.
We could go on and on associated with the Midwestern ag, just FYI, because there are lots of places across the globe like this. There was also swampland and wetlands throughout those prairie states, and those also obliterated. And that ties back into the water as part of soil health. Wetland management is central to all of that. Shifting to Bennett, the question from Lauren is, what do you think about man-made pocket forests? She's been seeing conversations about this online.
Good question. And jumping back to the prior one, Stephen, I'll echo your sentiment that yes, a lot of damage can be done with draft horses if they're not being used conscientiously and having that power applied well and for the right reasons. Absolutely. So pocket forests. So as I understand them, that's in more urbanized areas, often creating small, dense and diverse forests, on vacant lots or sites of just a few acres in size. Yeah, I love it. It just by size won't ever have the same, contiguous forest habitat that, many woodland species need, but as a tool to bring a forest into an urban area, to give people access to nature, to help with air and water quality, to use them as stormwater control devices. Absolutely, they're fantastic reuse of otherwise vacant space. I know that there's some grant funding going on soon to actually put some in Erie, not too far from Erie, Pennsylvania, not too far from where I am. And yes, they do bring a lot of benefit to urban areas.
Great, thank you. A question from Paul Starkey. He's interested in the observation that zero tillage improves the mycorrhiza content of the soil. And there's been recent research on how trees communicate through mycorrhiza in woodland. So are there similar relationships with mycorrhiza and non-woody crops?
So I guess I'd take that one. So I know Barbara mentioned Suzanne Simard's Finding the Mother Tree, which is a really great introduction to the mycorrhizal fungi association and the forest soil biome. And it's said that 60% of the carbon that is stored in an old forest of 80 to 120 years is below the soil. So even though we're talking about the largest, oldest forests, even true old growth forest, even there with the incredible amount of carbon stored in the woody biomass, 60% of it was under the ground. And much of that was in the form of the interconnecting hyphae of the mycorrhizal fungi and the various associations. So in the market garden, we do feel that the mycorrhizal associations are returning. Certainly the sapphiritic fungi in the form of various fruiting mushrooms and slime molds and things like that. Just love the wood chips that we use in the pathways. And even we do a bedded pack barn for our cows, which means they're on a composting bedded pack, which is comprised of wood chips. Of sawdust. So we're bringing a lot of forest products actually into our market garden environment. Now, one thing that as a qualifier, because we are using a good finished compost and also a lot of cover crops for feeding the soil, it might be that the mycorrhizal fungi are not as encouraged to be entering into the kind of associations of mutualistic symbiotic exchange with the plant roots as they would in a forest situation, because we're kind of feeding such a smorgasbord already through organic inputs to our plants. But nonetheless, I feel like once we're managing our 60 acres completely no-till, and I tend to believe that there's an interconnectivity that begins to happen in the whole farm system as an organism as we reduce the kind of drastic disturbances that are associated with tillage.
Great. This is the start of important conversations. We're going to have to wrap up with two final comments that come out of chat. Barbara reminds us that regarding economics of draft animals versus petroleum, that if you put that economic value on or quantify the economic value of forest services relative to water, soil, and air, draft animals come out ahead. And then from Klaus reminding us that living history museums and experimental archaeology sites like Kloster Lorsch and the Larsham, which he administers, engage in active research on these very topics that help us quantify these things. They have started a research project with partners in England to research how medieval or pre-industrial farming systems, that is the moldboard plow or ard plowing, affects soil life, such as mycorrhizal fungi. And this is interesting to see how these draft animal-powered systems with not so deep furrows will affect soil life. And from Pierre, and another comment about no tillage, but I believe that, sorry, Pierre, I think everyone can see these items in chat. Less soil destruction, better retention of earthworms, better soil potential to return or retain waters, feed expanding ecosystems. It's an affirmation of the ways everything is part of a huge cycle. And Steve Leslie reminds us of Ann and Eric Nodell's Soil Management and Draft Horse magazine and Small Farmers Journal too. Yeah. Oh, I hope we can do this reading circle. So in conclusion, thank you all for being part of this. AIMA is out there. We have our own website. There's the link. We regularly post information. Our latest blog is on agriculture in glass and glass in agriculture relative to the International Year of Glass. Next year is millets, so stay tuned. This associated program that Klaus and the Kloster Lorsch put together is a year on the field. It has a separate website, but flax is next year. And we hope to be with the AIMA Congress in India in 2023, November. But we are also going to continue to have these hour-long webinars on topics of international interest. And stay tuned for those. We thank you so much for participating. Thank you to our speakers in order, well, thanks to the Kloster Lorsch for hosting the Zoom and coordinating this, to Barbara Corson for launching us with our conversation on the reading list, to Stephen Leslie and Bennett Gould from taking time from busy schedules to be part of this. Thank you so much. And until next time. Bye-bye.
Have a great holiday season. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and applause for, I realize that at the end of the talk, there's a silence, and I wanted to applause, but everyone is just it's not spontaneous. So applause to all the speakers.
Yeah, they really deserve it.